just variation in working conditions on wage gaps by demographic groups and just overall wage inequality. And that's really motivated by, there's always been a lot of interest in understanding why these wage gaps exist, why there's so much wage inequality. And we were interested in understanding, can differences in working conditions actually explain these wage gaps, or will accounting for those differences in working conditions actually exacerbate our measures of wage inequality and wage gaps across demographics? I don't know why I didn't do this before. Okay, and so there's been kind of a related, there's been kind of this emerging literature that's really tried to randomize job characteristics and job attributes, whether that's for an actual real job or for hypothetical jobs. And I would say the kind of value added of what we're going to do is first off we asked we have a nationally representative sample, which is relatively new to this field, and then on top of that we tried to create like a comprehensive list of working conditions. Now, of course, we can't list every possible working condition that defines a job, but we tried to be more comprehensive than what the literature has done. So instead of just looking at one or two working conditions, we listed a lot more in our experiments. Okay, so first, our first main contribution is simply just understanding working conditions in the U.S. And how those vary across demographics and across the wage distribution. I'm actually not going to talk too much about this today, just because it's a very comprehensive set of working conditions. It's really hard to summarize. So the way we're going to summarize that is actually just by assigning a monetary value to different working conditions and then basically summing those up. And so the way we're going to assign those monetary values is by doing these state of preference experiments. So we're going to ask people to choose between some hypothetical jobs, which vary based on working conditions. That's going to, they vary based on the working conditions and the wages. We can see the trade-offs people are making between wages and working conditions. That's going to allow us to attach a value to those working conditions. And then we can start thinking about how wage gaps start to change when you start to incorporate the differences in amenities. So we use the American Life Panel for this project. The ALP has some nice features here. It's nationally representative. It's an internet-based sample, but it has a very high response rate. So the response rate for us was over 60% for all of our surveys. We fielded the American Working Conditions Survey in June 2015. We followed that up a little bit later with the state of preference experiments. Actually, everything I'm going to be talking about today is the state of preference experiments, because we actually re-asked about a subset of the working conditions at that time, simply because we wanted to know exactly what working conditions they had at that time when we were trying to figure out their valuations. And then for this paper, we selected on the working population ages 25 to 71. And so we end up with a sample of over 1,800 people. Okay, I'll jump to the key findings so you're not in too much suspense here. So we find really large differences in amenities by demographic groups and across the wage distribution. One nice way to summarize our findings for how much people value amenities is just going to be how much they value basically all the amenities. And the way we do that is we think about switching from the worst job that we have to the best job. And we find that workers care about amenities a lot, equivalent to about a 56% wage increase. So that sounds large, but I also should point out here that the difference between the worst job here and the best job is also really large. So in general, though, we're finding people really care about amenities. We also find that the preferences for these working conditions varies a lot across groups, and I'll show you some evidence of that. The reason why we adopt the state of preference approach, and I probably should have said this a little bit earlier, is just, if you've done the typical hedonic wage regressions where you just compare people who have certain working conditions versus those who don't, it's pretty clear that doesn't provide the right estimates. If you think about people's skill in relation to how the market values their skills, people with more skill according to the market are probably going to demand a combination of better wages and better working conditions, right? So you get kind of a correlation between better conditions and better wages. So we didn't want to do that. So a state of preference approach allows us to have allows us to control the jobs and have random variation. And then I'll try to get to this at the end. We find that when you incorporate amenities into the wage distribution, that does actually significantly alter, and with some exceptions, it tends to exacerbate wage inequality and wage gaps. Okay, so we wanted to define the job sort of as comprehensively as possible. So we focused on we have several different dimensions: schedule flexibility, telecommuting possibilities, the physical demands of the job, the pace of the work, how much independence you have, paid time off, working in teams. This is also paired with how you're evaluated. So are you evaluated by yourself or evaluated as a team? Job training opportunities and meaningful work. So let me just show you an example of this. So this is what the respondents would see. They would choose between job A and job B. They were told that anything not listed is the exact same in all other ways. And then we would randomly select. So basically, most of these characteristics are the same across the two jobs. We randomly would choose 2 characteristics which would vary. The point of this was we didn't want to have 7 things varying at a time. We just thought that would be too hard to answer, and there'd just be kind of a cognitive overload problem. So we varied 2 at a time plus the wage. Okay, so we varied hours. So number of hours. Do you get to set your own schedule, or is it the schedule set by the manager? Options to telecommute, yes or no. Moderate physical activity versus heavy physical activity versus mostly sitting would be the other option. Relaxed versus fast-paced. You can choose how you do your own work. Your tasks and procedures are well-defined. Paid time off can be none, 10, or 20 days. Do you mainly work by yourself, or do you mainly work with others? And then if you work with others, how are you evaluated? Training opportunities, and then do you have occasional or frequent opportunities to make a positive impact on your community or society, and then your wage. Okay, so the people would choose between job A and job B. They'd actually do 10 of these, and that would be that's our data. Okay, so now we have basically, we can see how people are thinking about the trade-off between working conditions and wages. We just estimate a simple logit model of job choice where we just include the job characteristics additively, hours, and the log of wage, and that allows us to back out a willingness to pay. So I'm going to report willingness to pay estimates as a percentage of the wage. So if you see an estimate of 0.1, that means that gaining that amenity is equivalent to a 10% wage increase. Okay, so here's what our results look like. And let me point out, and so I'm showing you the blue dots, and I apologize that we only differentiated these by color coding. I know that's a problem for some people. So the dots mainly on the right, the blue dots, these are our stated preferences estimates. You can see the red dots on the left, that typically are on the left, are the compensating differential estimates. That's if you just do your typical hedonic wage regression. So it's kind of interesting, they tend to be opposite signs. That kind of falls in line with my argument before about the bias and the compensating differential estimates. I also note that the confidence intervals or the state preference estimates are much tighter. Basically, randomization is amazing. They're also doing 10 of these, so that also really helps. Okay, so basically what these estimates are, so each row here, this is saying what is the value of setting your own schedule versus the counterfactual here, the excluded category, which here is schedule set by a manager. This is saying that setting your own schedule is equivalent to a 9% wage increase. People also value telecommuting. People really care about physical activity. So moderate physical activity is actually valued more than sitting, but that's equivalent to a 15% wage increase versus about a 12% wage increase for sitting relative to heavy physical activity. People really like a relaxed pace, some independence at work. People really like paid time off, maybe not surprisingly. And then people want to work by themselves. If they have to work on a team, they like to be evaluated on their own merits. They like training opportunities, they like frequent opportunities to serve their community. Okay, and then we see some demographic variation in this. So this is just by gender, and generally, women seem to value the amenities more than men. You can see that the extreme is with physical activity, but also you can see that some of that with schedule flexibility, like telecommuting and paid time off. You can see that women value those things more than men on average. One way just to kind of summarize all this is to just think about the worst job to best job metric I was telling you about earlier. And you can see if women just value amenities at about 60%, while men, it's close, but it's about 53% for men. Okay, we can do this for education. So basically, as you go further down in the dots, you get higher education. And basically, maybe not that surprisingly, but higher educated people value working conditions more. Again, these things are expressed in percentage of the wage, not level. So this isn't necessarily just an issue of they have more money, so they're willing to spend more on working conditions implicitly. This is proportional to the wage. So again, it's maybe not that surprising that even accounting for that, they're bigger, but you do see higher educated people care about amenities more. And to summarize that, you can see there's this kind of monotonic relationship where people with a college degree value those amenities at 60% as a 60% wage increase. And you can do the same thing by just the wage distribution. So here we just broke it down by quintiles, and I'll just kind of skip to the here you see close to a monotonic relationship where the highest wage people value amenities the most. And then really the big outliers by age. These outliers here are the 62 plus group. So they really care about physical activity or lack of physical activity. They really like schedule flexibility. They really want to work alone, and they really like independence at work. So you can see that how extreme kind of the older age group is, that they're valuing amenities as like a 75% wage increase relative to younger ages, which are closer to 45%. Okay. And then the paper, I'm not going to go into this, as a host of sensitivity tests and validation tests. The main one is you might be kind of, why'd we just estimate a simple logit model? You're supposed to put in heterogeneity, mainly for simplicity. So if the paper has mixed logit models in there, you get basically the same mean estimates. My preferred approach is a special regressor method, which allows you to estimate mean willingness to pay estimates without any distributional assumptions. You get the exact same thing. So just for simplicity, we just have been doing the simple logit here. The big concern with stated preference experiments, of course, is that are people answering in a way that actually reflects what they would do in a real life situation? So one test of that is we do find that people, for example, who currently have a flexible schedule value schedule flexibility more. So that's kind of suggesting that there's a correlation between revealed and stated preferences. Now you might just worry there's like an endowment effect there, that people are just kind of answering, oh, I have that, so I value it. So one thing that we are able to do is we fielded the survey again 3 years later. We can see people's transitions into amenities and out of amenities. And basically people who transition into amenity, they didn't have it at the time, but they actually they value it more than other people. People transition out of an amenity, same thing. They actually value that amenity less than people who do not transition out of amenity. So that kind of gets us away from the endowment effect, but we're still finding that people are answering in a way that kind of reflects their true preferences. Okay, so let me try to wrap up here by talking about the implications on wage differentials. So basically we're gonna just we have those we have how people's amenities vary. We have values to attach to those amenities. Now let's change the wage structure by accounting for working conditions. And we can see, and so in general, we find that this exacerbates existing wage gaps. So non-whites in our data make 21.4% less than whites. When you add in working conditions, that gap grows to 26.8%. The education gradient grows, so college graduates make 53.2% more than non-college graduates in our data. That gap grows to over 60%. And the age gradient grows a lot as well. And you can see that by how the 62 plus group was really valued those amenities. Interestingly, the gender gap actually decreases. So the wage gap in our data, women make 18.7% less than men. That actually is reduced to 13%. And that's mainly because women really value the lack of having moderate physical activity or a job where they're mostly sitting. And they have a lot of those jobs. So that's actually, and meaningful work is the other one, which actually seems to bring this gap a lot. So the women tend to be in jobs which are meaningful relative to men. And then overall wage inequality gets exacerbated. Whatever your favorite metric is, 90th to 50th percentile, 50th to 10th percentile, the wage gap increases quite substantially when you add in working conditions. Okay, so just to wrap up, we find big differences in amenities by demographic groups. We also find that just in general, people really care about working conditions, and that how much they care seems to vary a lot by demographic groups. We found the SP approach really delivered plausible estimates, more plausible than kind of the traditional hedonic wage regression approach, but also just kind of it looked like, we were able to validate it in certain ways that suggested that these are probably somewhat plausible estimates, even just evaluated on their own. So I think I'm probably over time, so I'll just wrap up there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. You are on time. This is very good. Thank you. And that was really interesting work. So let's go over to Jenna next. And attendees, I think you can ask questions in Q&A. Panelists, if you have questions, just drop them in chat and we'll sort them out. Have both of them later. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. I'm going to present some joint work with some co-authors, Sarah Bana, Kelly Bedard, and Rossin-Slater. In this paper, we look at the role of firms in explaining differences in the take-up of public, universally available leave-taking social insurance benefits available to California workers. We focus on two types of these leave-taking social insurance benefits. The first is called short-term disability insurance, and the second is paid family leave. Short-term disability insurance provides access to partial wage replacement during periods of non-work due to own illness or injury, and paid family leave provides the same benefit to care for a new child or a sick relative. So I'll tell you more about the program details in just a minute, but I want to just highlight here that in this paper, we're really going to be focused on how does the employer that you work for affect the probability of making a social insurance claim. And the kind of key feature in California is that there's near universal eligibility among workers. So we're kind of abstracting away from employer provision of these benefits. So thinking about access or take up of paid leave is important for a number of reasons. Leave-taking benefits have been shown to have positive labor market and health effects, not only for workers themselves, but also for their family members, and particularly in the case of benefits that provide access to leave during periods of contagious illness can have very large positive externalities as well. Of course, we're seeing this right now with COVID and the limitations on leave taking available to many workers. Despite the positive benefits, though, access to these paid leave programs are quite limited in the US in the absence of a federal paid leave program. Most leave is employer provided, and of course, employer provided access is not only very limited, but also highly unequal across the socioeconomic status gradient, where more skilled and higher wage workers are much more likely to have access to these and other types of paid leave benefits than our lower wage, lower skill workers. The exception is that 4 states have both short-term medical and family leave programs, including California. A few other states have one or the other, or are adopting these types of programs in the coming years. So in this paper, we're going to provide the first evidence on the role of firms in explaining differences in the use or take-up of these types of social insurance benefits. And more specifically, we're going to ask, how does what's called the firm earnings premium affect benefit take-up? The firm earnings premium is something that comes from a literature known often as the AKM literature, which identifies essentially observably similar firms that pay observably similar workers different wages. And more specifically, the idea is let's identify how much a particular firm pays its workers relative to what those same workers would get paid if they worked at a different firm. So you can think of this as just what is the part of a worker's wages that's determined not by their own productivity or skills, but by the fact that they kind of ended up in a relatively better paying firm versus a relatively worse paying firm. We're going to evaluate the effect of this employer earnings premium on the number of employees or the share of employees within a firm who make a disability or paid family leave claim. The relationship between how well a firm pays its workers and take-up rates of these public benefits is theoretically ambiguous for a number of reasons. You might think that the opportunity cost of taking leave is increasing in how well you're paid. You might think that the incidence of firm-provided benefits may matter. And you might think that it depends on whether wages and non-wage benefits are complements or substitutes. In a compensating differentials type model, of course, we would think that they would be substitutes. In a rent sharing model, we might think that they might be complements. And it also depends on whether firms provide their own paid leave benefits, which might be substitutes for state-provided benefits. But also, even if the firm does not provide paid leave to its workers or some of its workers, does the firm allow its workers the flexibility to take even unpaid leave? So understanding the role of firms is important, not only because the effects are theoretically ambiguous, but because we know from the existing literature that it's hard to influence take-up decisions on other margins. So just as an example, a host of recent work has shown that policymakers have limited tools at their disposal to influence take-up rates of these programs. So for example, changes in the wage replacement rate of sick leave and family leave programs have very limited effects on take-up in a number of settings. In contrast, in this paper, we find that firm-specific factors are actually a major driver of the disparities in the use of these two public social insurance programs. A back-of-the-envelope calculation indicates, based on our results, indicates that if all firms behaved as those in the top third of the firm earnings premium distribution, we would expect increased take-up rates of about 25 to 30%. So these are really large and economically meaningful effects in terms of overall take-up in California. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about the leave-taking programs, and then I'll tell you about our identification strategy and results. California has two types of paid leave available to workers, disability insurance and paid family leave. Both of these are funded entirely through employee payroll taxes. The current combined tax rate for the two programs is 1% of wages up to an annual cap. Participation is importantly mandatory for most private sector employees in the state. So more than 18 million workers are currently covered under these programs. And importantly, the work requirements for eligibility for coverage are incredibly low. You have to have earned at least $300 in taxable wages in the past 5 quarters. So this means that essentially everyone with any formal market recent job history is covered under this program. So you can think of this as essentially a universally available benefit to workers. As I said earlier, disability insurance covers individuals unable to work due to a non-work-related illness or injury. This is separate from workers' compensation. As of 1979, disability insurance includes pregnancy-related disability, so birth mothers can make a DI claim. Paid family leave was introduced later in 2004. It provides 6 weeks of leave to either bond with a new child or care for a sick family member. Birth mothers are eligible to make a disability insurance claim for recovery from pregnancy and birth, and also a PFL claim to bond with that new child. Both of these programs are partial wage replacement insurance plans. Workers receive 55% wage replacement during the period that we study here, up to a maximum weekly benefit amount. The replacement rate is the same for both of the two programs, and these programs are really intended to cover longer term absences compared to what you would typically think of as like access to paid sick days, individual sick days through one's employer. These programs do not explicitly include job protection, which can be an issue for some workers, but many workers are eligible to simultaneously take job protected unpaid leave through the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act. Okay, so to look at the effect of the firm earnings premiums on claim rates, we linked together two data sets from the California Employer Development Department. The first is a data set on the universe of DI and PFL claims. We're going to start looking at claims in 2004 because that's the year that paid family leave becomes available, but we have data on DI claims going back to 2000, and everything looks similar if we go back for those claims. This data set includes information on the type of claim, the date of the claim, how much is paid, and then a little bit of information about the employee, including their age and gender, and a unique identifier that can be linked over time. We also have an indicator for whether birth mothers file associated disability insurance and paid family leave claims for the same birth event. This is going to be important because we're going to link those claims together and treat them as a single claim. They're generally taken consecutively, one right after the other. And from the perspective of the worker and the perspective of the firm, this is kind of one extended period of leave. We're going to link this claims data then with quarterly earnings data. This data covers all employees, all employers that report to the EDD tax branch. And this is essentially all employers in the state that have at least one employee. This data includes earnings for each worker in each quarter in each job, the employer identifier and the industry of the employer, an individual identifier that can be linked across these data sets. But the quarterly earnings data does not contain other demographic data on employees. And so we're only going to have demographic data available for anyone who ever files a leave claim during this period. We can and do, though, merge the administrative data with industry level demographic data from the ACS. And so this is going to allow us to control at a little bit higher level for demographic differences in composition. Okay, the main outcomes that I'm going to show you today are the number of claims made in a firm year. In the main results I'm going to show you, we're going to separate claims by the type of claim and also the gender of the claimant. And we're going to do this for a couple of reasons. The first is that, as you can see here, take-up rates of these different types of claims are just very different. So disability insurance claims are much more common, for example, than leaves to care for a sick relative. But also you might think that firm norms regarding work absences for these different reasons might be different. So in a particular firm, for example, it might be very acceptable for mothers to take leave following the birth of a child, but it might be much less socially acceptable for fathers to take leave to stay home with their new child, or, for example, to take leave because of back pain or something like that. Okay, so to estimate these results, we're going to proceed in two steps. First, we're going to estimate the firm-specific earnings premiums, and then I'll show you the relationship between those premiums and leave-taking rates. So to estimate firm earnings premiums, we're going to follow a well-established literature, often referred to as the AKM literature, which proposes modeling log wages as a function of additive worker and firm fixed effects. And the idea here is we're going to identify, essentially based on people who change jobs, how much of one's wage is determined by just how well on average a firm pays versus that individual's own fixed effect. Okay, so the basic equation is quite simple. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because it's pretty standard in this literature. We're just going to estimate a regression that regresses earnings on worker and firm fixed effects. What we're interested in here is this phi parameter. This is going to be the firm fixed effect, and it's going to measure how well a firm pays its workers on average relative to how those same workers would be paid if they worked elsewhere. We're going to take these estimated phis and standardize them, and then we're going to estimate a Poisson model of the effect of these firm earning premiums on the number of claims made within a firm year, controlling for the firm size, the percent female in the industry, and industry and time fixed effects. Okay, so here are the main results. This table shows the estimates from Poisson regression. So the coefficients are translated into incidence ratios. So anything greater than 1 is a positive effect. The way you should interpret these coefficients, this first one, for example, says increasing the firm's earnings premium by 1 standard deviation would increase the number of female claims within the firm year by about 45%. So these are large, economically very significant effects. You can see that the effects are robust across the different types of claims, DI claims, bonding claims, and carrying claims. You can also see that these effects are robust across the gender of the claimant. We see positive and large effects for both men and women. The magnitudes differ a little bit, but these are these are incidence rate ratios, so they're essentially percent effects, and you can see that the mean number of claims differs fairly substantially. So the question then becomes, is this driven by the fact that these better paying firms are somehow different, or is this driven by the fact that different types of workers are sorting into these different types of firms based on the likelihood, for example, of needing to utilize these leave programs? So to get at that, I'm going to first just show you some heterogeneity across different worker and firm characteristics. We see very similar effects among younger and older workers for all of these different types of claims, suggesting that it's not just better paying firms have, for example, older workers who are more at risk of having health events. We see very, again, economically meaningful effects for all ages. We also see similar effects across the firm size distribution. So this is not driven by just large or small firms, for example. We see significant effects across most different types of industries. So this graph just shows the 6 largest industries in California. And the results are consistently positive and, again, economically meaningful for all industries, with the sole exception of manufacturing. And then finally, you might be concerned that these better paying firms are just essentially allowing their highest paid, most valued workers who already likely have access to firm provided benefits to take claims against the state instead of using the benefits they were just already entitled to. So we estimate effects by the within firm earnings quartile of the claimant. And we find, actually, contrary to that notion, the effects are largest for the lowest paid workers within the firm. This is really important, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, it suggests that this is not just a substitution between leave paid by the firm and leave paid by the state for those workers who already likely have access to leave. But these higher paying firms, these higher fixed effect firms, are actually increasing leave taking rates among all workers in the firm. It also suggests that these high earnings premium firms are doing something to decrease the within firm inequality in access to paid leave benefits. Okay, so far I've showed you that these higher earnings premium firms have much higher leave taking rates. These effects are pretty robust across claimant and firm characteristics, suggesting that these relationships are unlikely to be able to operate primarily through sorting. We also look at some other outcomes that, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you unless there's interest later. But higher earnings premium firms have, on average, slightly shorter leave duration. A higher share of claimants from higher earnings premium firms return to work at the firm. And these higher earnings premium firms have higher earnings growth among claimants who return to the same firm. And so this is all suggesting that these higher earnings premium firms are better in some sense, and I think in particular are better able to mitigate or reduce the cost associated with taking leave or being absent from work. These results are quite robust to controlling for a bunch of other stuff. We find very similar results when we control for alternate measures of firm quality or firm desirability, when we control for measures of average worker productivity in various ways, when we control for the growth rate of the firm, and we can collapse everything to the industry level and include individual worker controls from the ACS, and again find similar results when directly controlling for some worker characteristics and firm provided benefits. So the last thing I wanted to just very briefly mention is, should we still be worried about sorting? We saw that these results are robust across different types of workers and different types of firms, but we still should worry a little bit about whether individuals who expect to need to make a claim in the future are sorting into firms that would make this easier. And the quick answer is no. We find absolutely no evidence of workers moving to different types of firms in anticipation of taking leave. This graph essentially just shows that workers who move from a lower earnings premium firm to a higher earnings premium firm have no different patterns in the probability of making claims than workers who do not. So just very briefly to conclude, firm-specific factors are a major driver of disparities in the use of public social insurance benefits. We find that disability insurance and paid family leave take-up is considerably higher in high earnings premium firms. Overall, we find a 1 standard deviation increase in the firm earnings premium is associated with about a 57% increase in the incidence rate of claims. So again, this is a very large and economically meaningful effect. In terms of policy implications, we find that that firms are able to affect take-up more than other direct policy levers that policymakers have at their disposal, things like increasing the wage replacement rate or the duration of benefits. And this is really important moving forward because if we want to encourage people to take leave or increase the take-up rates of these programs, we really need to think harder about what these high earnings premium firms are doing or not doing to allow their workers to access the benefits to which they're at least theoretically entitled. Thank you.
That was great, Jenna. Thanks so much. Really impressive data collection and analysis and results. It's great. Please, we'll turn it over to Jason now. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A. I know the panelists can't use the Q&A. I wonder if any of the attendees can. Email me if you're having trouble with it at asojourn@umn.edu, and we'll figure out how to deal with it if that's the problem. Otherwise, just post some questions there. So if you want. Okay, Jason Socken, University of Pennsylvania. It's got about 10 minutes for the two papers. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. And thanks, Jenna, and thanks, David, for these presentations. As someone who's really interested in these kind of issues, I really enjoyed reading both these papers. I'll try to keep it to 10 minutes. I thought I had 15, so apologies if I rush a little bit through my slides. Essentially, the first paper, The Value of Working Conditions in the United States and Implications for the Structure of Wages, as David sort of presented, I'll go through a brief summary of each of the papers, and I'll think about sort of a bigger picture, what this kind of tells us about the labor market and how to think about these issues in a larger scenario, and then getting into some sort of more specific questions and comments about the papers. But the first paper sort of looks at a survey of workers and tries to elicit willingness to pay for these 9 workplace amenities. And these amenities are going to be specifically related to working conditions. The respondents are asked to choose between jobs where pay and amenities are altered And then using that, depending upon the sort of revealed preference into which they would choose or which they would like, we can sort of estimate how much they're willing to pay for these working place conditions. And they're going to use a sort of indirect utility approach. And then with those estimates, they'll try and make a larger claim about, is compensation inequality different from wage inequality? Are we necessarily omitting some sort of wedge here because we're not accounting for these oft overlooked things like workplace conditions? What does it find? Well, workers on average have positive willingness to pay for sort of all 9 attributes, affirming this idea that amenities have true monetary value to workers. There's market heterogeneity underneath that. So across demographics, for specific attributes like requiring physical activity, we saw sort of by age, setting their own schedule, and telecommuting. So essentially, workers value these things, but there's heterogeneity in these valuations. So the second main takeaway is that not everyone has access to or has better workplace conditions. And so this could possibly reflect supply constraints, that not every job offers these. And so there's some sort of limitation on how many jobs can sort of have these workplace conditions. And there could also be demand side issues here where there's preferences. And so people might want certain jobs. And so we sort of see selection into certain conditions for certain populations. And so I'd say that's the second main takeaway. And then the third one is sort of that understanding compensation inequality necessarily requires understanding amenity valuations. And so accounting for amenities and specifically preference for these amenities sort of narrows the gender gap, but also widens racial and education gaps. I think this lends itself to a larger issue of how do we think about amenities? Is it sort of individual valuations, or is there some sort of universal valuation that we should think about when it comes to having telecommuting, having physical activity, setting your own schedule, these kind of things? And so in sort of understanding compensation inequality, we really need to think about these preferences as well for these amenities. Sort of the second paper, Unequal Use of Social Insurance Benefits, the Role of Employers, that Jenna presented, what it sort of does is it uses employee-employer matched earnings data, and it's going to estimate these sort of two-way fixed effects, these AKM models, for both workers and firms. It's going to do a nice job of sort of obtaining this data that's sort of the universe of employee disability insurance claims and paid family leave claims since 2004 in California. So using earnings in California and these sort of claims, they'll link these two data sets and try and understand how earnings or sort of how firm paid premia that they estimate is going to relate to take up in disability insurance and paid family leave. And then what they'll do with that is investigate how this relation sort of differs by worker and firm characteristics. So what are the main takeaways in my view from this paper? Well, the first is that, as Jenna sort of presented, that workers are more likely to file these claims from higher paying firms. And so we sort of see this positive relation between higher pay and more claim uptake. Two, so this increase is not uniform throughout the firm, but it's mostly driven by low earners. So this is some sort of heterogeneity within the firm of who's actually taking this uptake in claims. Third is that employees sort of make shorter claims, they're more likely to return to, and they experience faster wage growth after returning to higher paying firms, saying something about some sort of warm glow, if you will, that maybe workers enjoy, so the fact that they can take this kind of claim from these firms, and so they're happier to return to, more likely to return to, and experience a faster growth. Maybe they work overtime, so they have higher earnings when they get back. And so that was sort of my third takeaway. And then the fourth one is that the authors kind of attribute this increasing take-up of paid leave to firm-specific culture. They say that this pay is sort of capturing something sort of intrinsic to the firm. Maybe they're more tolerant of workers taking leave. And so that's why we kind of see this positive relation. Where does this sort of take us, I think, in terms of a bigger picture? Also, please ignore the goofy on my mug. I'm back at my parents' because of COVID, so there's a lot of Disney stuff in my house. So please ignore the mug that I'm drinking my coffee out of. But in terms of the bigger picture, is that we tend to think about these workplace conditions as maybe an oft overlooked aspect of a job, but it's clear that workers sort of value them, and access to them is not universal. And each amenity is not uniformly valued. We see this heterogeneity in preferences for these amenities. And so this suggests that firms can differentially cater different menus of options to employees to sort of strategically pick out what kind of workers they want at their firm. Third, I would say, is that a high willingness to pay and this variation in supply lends itself to a potentially important sorting mechanism. Is that we see if there may be scarce opportunities and a high willingness to pay, we might see increased competition for jobs that sort of offer these conditions that David showed that we kind of value. And the last thing I would say is that how amenities relate to inequality is not clear cut. Should amenities be assigned universal values, or should they vary by one's preferences? do we think about access to amenities or do we think about take up of these amenities? As sort of Jenna said, is that there's differences between access and take up. And so how do we really think about amenities when we're trying to think about inequality? So I would just say the outstanding questions I have with regards to each paper is that, so from Mesis et al., is that it sort of finds that workers are willing to pay more for the workplace conditions that they enjoy in their current employment than others do not. And David sort of speaks to this maybe as an endowment effect. I was thinking more of maybe this is a justification for experience goods, is that maybe I don't know I like working by myself and being evaluated by myself until I actually have that. So there's a growing literature that jobs are experience goods, and maybe this is a good explanation for why they are, is that I actually don't know how much I value these conditions until I experience them. So maybe there is some causal effect there. Second is that by studying transitions, they show that workers are more likely to switch into conditions or into opportunities with workplace conditions they value more strongly. And so my big question I would say is that, does this have aggregate implications, right? So they sort of take weights from CPS to bring into their data. Can they take data and bring their own data, bring into the CPS? Do we see larger employment gaps by gender, by race, by age in occupations, industries, metros, firms that have better workplace conditions that you would expect this sort of sorting mechanism to happen along? And then third, I would say is that stated preference estimates that they have are very different from these compensating differential estimates. And so does this speak to an issue that maybe compensating differentials are not the way we should think about workplace conditions, that maybe we're thinking about in the wrong way, and, or it does reflect simply that fringe benefits and workplace conditions are not the same thing. And so maybe we need to think about, compensating differentials applying in one set, but maybe not for another. And then I think I'm almost out of time. So just in my last minute, I'll just talk about Bana et al. As well. So my sort of outstanding questions here is that they sort of attribute their finding that higher paying firms tend to have increased take-up rates to improve firm culture. But it makes me question, is this the best data set to answer that question? Should we be thinking about paid premium to capture culture, or are there other ways we can try and capture that and get heterogeneity across firms in their culture, and maybe through lists of the 100 best firms or something like that? And so do we think about pay as the best way to capture that? So my second thing is that I think the most striking result to me was the sort of difference of the negative sorting in claims that we saw within firms, that really was the largest margins were from lower productivity workers at these higher paying firms. And this is sort of evident across all types of claims and by gender. But I felt it was also a little bit underdeveloped. And I was wondering if maybe, is this true across firms as well? Is it always that it's the lowest earning workers are sort of the ones that are taking up these claims? So maybe using the worker fixed effects from the AKM, can that help shed light on this? And if so, does that say about something about the types of workers that are more likely to take selection, or sorry, to select and to leave take up? And then the last thing I think is, I'm just very much out of time, is that I think in their earnings data, they can't disentangle between hours and wages. And so, is it reflecting a higher uptake from less attached workers or from relatively low earners, or both? And so it makes the interpretation a little less clear. Is it an extensive margin issue where people are less attached, so they're more likely to take claims? Or is it people that are tending to be low productivity, low earners, and they're the ones that are more likely to take claims within the firm? And then I guess the last thing with sort of this claim rate is that they look at the level of claims, and just curious as to why they switch from the rate of claims to the level of claims. I think in their first table, in their first figure, they look at the rate, but then they switch over to the level. And so just curious why they would think about that, because if I was thinking about culture sort of driving this effect, I'd say that it would be an increased probability of the average worker in the firm being more likely to, rather than just the level of claims. And so I'll sort of leave my discussion at that, but I really enjoyed both papers, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for reading those so carefully and bringing up a lot of good insights on them and questions. I don't see questions in the Q&A, so we have about 3 minutes left here. And so I'd ask David or Jenna if you have any interest in responding or just elaborating. I know there have also been some questions through the panelists. If there's anything you want to point out, David, you have a minute or two.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything. I guess what I said, the endowment effect, you thought was kind of an experience effect. I totally agree with that. I think that's probably more likely. But other than that, yeah, no problems. I agree with everything. So don't be embarrassed by a goofy coffee mug. I mean, that would be my only point of contention. So.
Jenna?
Yeah, I would just say, I think this came up in the chat too, and I haven't answered it yet, but So in terms of kind of the distribution of claims overall, claims are highest actually for middle to high income workers. The highest income workers, or the claim distribution by income is not entirely monotonic, but it's the highest for about the third quartile in the earnings distribution, and then a little bit lower for workers at the very top. But we find that the effect of the, even though the claim rates are overall are higher for higher income workers on average, the effect of the firm premium is the largest for the lower income workers. So it's not that these workers are more likely overall to take leave. It's that at these better quality firms, there's less of an income gradient than there is in the the lower fixed effect firms. In terms of whether that's, in terms of Jason's comment about whether that's lower productivity, we don't have hours, so it's hard to look at that directly. What we have done is kind of looked separately by what are likely low wage and or part-time workers, and we find that the effects are not driven by them. As you would expect, they do have lower claim rates than the rest of the sample.
Awesome, thank you, Jenna. All right, we'll kick off the next two papers, starting with Matthew Johnson, and we have 20 minutes, and we'll go over to Ioana.
Cool.
Wait, Matthew.
What's that? Are we good? Okay. All right. Thanks, Aaron, for organizing such a great session. It's really great to be here. I'm Matt Johnson from the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke. I'm presenting joint work with Amanda Grittner, who's at Apt Associates. Okay, let's get going. So I'm not sure if it's a good sign or a bad sign when I can summarize the motivation for a paper in a single tweet, but here goes. So last year, there was this horrendous collapse of a hotel that was being built in New Orleans, where the hotel collapsed while being built. 3 workers died, a couple dozen more were injured. And the day after the collapse, one of the workers who was involved spoke to a local news station to raise issues about concerns that had been brought up at the job site, talk about his experience there. That worker happened to be an undocumented immigrant, and a few days later, that worker was deported. And that report ushered in this tweet by David Michaels, who is the head of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, for several years. This idea that a surefire way to endanger the safety and health of all workers, terrify undocumented workers so they won't raise concerns about job site safety hazards. So, in some ways, this paper is an empirical test of the extent to which the prediction in this tweet by Dr. David Michaels is true. One way that workers can raise complaints or concerns about job hazards is by talking to local news, but a more formal way they can do this is by complaining to government agencies about illegal or hazardous working conditions. And indeed, many regulators that oversee the labor market rely on these types of complaints to target their enforcement efforts. So OSHA, the agency that David Michaels headed, about 20% of its enforcement inspections are triggered by a worker complaint. Another subdivision of the Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division, which does stuff like minimum wage and overtime, about 75% of its inspections are triggered by a worker complaint. At the far extreme, the EEOC, 100% of its enforcement efforts are triggered by a worker complaint. And despite this widespread use, it's not totally clear if for regulators that have very scarce resources, that this is an effective approach. Right now, on the plus side, this could be kind of a form of decentralized targeting, right? There's very likely asymmetric information where workers know better than government bureaucrats where the hazardous or illegal working conditions are. But at the same time, we go into this in the paper much more. There's lots of barriers that workers might have to complaining. There's the threat of employer retaliation, which is in theory illegal, but rarely enforced. There's knowledge gaps about how to complain or, workers' rights to complain. There's a public goods problem, et cetera. And it's quite possible that these barriers to complain could be correlated with the presence of hazards, in which case the workers most likely to complain might not actually be those exposed to the highest hazards. or illegal conditions, I should say. Now that's from the regulator's point of view, from kind of the worker-employer dynamic. It's quite likely that workers' threat of complaining can serve as a deterrent for employers. This is because, when a worker complains to the government, it can be costly for employers. Complaining entails, regulatory scrutiny, potential fines from the regulator, the potential for negative publicity from all that, et cetera. So it seems possible that changes in workers' propensity to complain could actually lead to changes in the job hazards or working conditions that they face. But it's also worth saying that it's not clear that this would be a first order effect. While we might think that, yes, in theory, complaining could matter for the provision of these sorts of things, we might think that labor market competition and other sorts of disciplinary forces from the market might mitigate the extent to which this complaining actually matters for the provision of these types of working conditions. So what we're going to do in this paper is try to assess the implications of this complaint-driven enforcement of regulations on workplace worker safety in the context of local immigration enforcement. So let me talk about how we arrive at this idea. So the first thing we do is we draw on a wide literature, both in economics and other fields like sociology, that Hispanic workers face higher barriers to complain relative to non-Hispanic counterparts. This might be because of, again, these sorts of knowledge gaps, language barriers, fewer outside job opportunities, et cetera. And we provide some descriptive evidence of these relatively high barriers, which I'll get to in a couple slides. And then we'll, again, go off of a couple prior papers to go with the idea that immigration enforcement is going to raise undocumented workers' costs of complaining. This is often called a chilling effect, where in an era of enhanced immigration enforcement, any interaction with government officials might be more risky by raising the specter of deportation. So it might reduce the willingness of any government engagement, including complaining about any sorts of illegal or hazardous conditions. And this chilling effect might extend not just to undocumented workers, but also to citizen and documented Hispanic workers. So there's a great paper by Marcela Alzano and Crystal Yang who show that take-up of social insurance is affected by immigration enforcement, even for Hispanic citizens, because Hispanic citizens might be more likely to live with or work with or be in similar communities of other undocumented individuals. So this chilling effect of immigration enforcement might be wide-reaching in terms of who it affects, and the scale of it could be potentially kind of economically meaningful. Right now, the U.S. spends a massive amount of money on immigration enforcement, about $20 billion a year. So the extent to which this plays a role could have real effects of the provision of these sorts of conditions in the workplace. So what we do in this paper is we examine the effects of immigration enforcement on workplace complaints to OSHA and worker injuries. So as our measure of immigration enforcement, we use secure communities. Again, we are building on prior work that's also looked at different kinds of effects of the secure communities program. This was a localized immigration enforcement program that was rolled out across US counties from 2008 to 2013. We use this geographic variation combined with variation in demographics across workplaces to use a triple difference research design to try to isolate the causal effect of immigration enforcement. And I'll talk much more about this design in a couple of slides. Okay, so let me just get right into it. I'll leave you in suspense without giving you the preview of the results. So let me tell you about the data we use for our analysis here. So to undertake this analysis, we really need three things. We need measures of worker complaints and workplace injuries. We need measures of workplace demographics, and our measure of local immigration enforcement. So let me just talk about these in turn here. So to measure worker complaints and workplace injuries, we're going to use administrative data from OSHA. So our measure of worker complaints is going to be OSHA inspections that are triggered by a worker complaint. So I'm going to gloss over some details here that are, in much more detail in the paper. But under the statutory act that made OSHA into being, which was I think signed into law 50 years ago, as of 2 days ago. Workers have the right to file a complaint with OSHA when they feel that they are being exposed to safety hazards or other sorts of illegal conditions. About 60% of these complaints result in an OSHA inspection. The other 40%, often if the worker doesn't sign it or something else goes on, OSHA gets in touch with the employer but doesn't actually inspect them. So we're going to use the subset of complaints that result in an inspection for this analysis. I have an ongoing FOIA request to get the rest of the complaints, which we'll hopefully have very soon, but not for this presentation. Our measure of workplace injuries is going to be OSHA inspections triggered by a serious accident. So serious accident here is a worker fatality or hospitalization of 3 or more workers. In the event of an injury or an accident like this, employers are required by law to report those injuries to OSHA, and OSHA is required to subsequently inspect that workplace. And they're required to inspect the workplace within a week or 2. So the occurrence of these sorts of inspections is a reliable indicator of the occurrence of these sorts of serious injuries, and prior work has established that these are reliable measures. Now, what this means is we're going to miss the occurrence of less serious injuries that don't trigger this kind of inspection, but we think this is a reliable measure of the occurrence of serious injuries. Again, this source is OSHA's administrative data. It's called the IMIS data set. I think it actually might have a new name now. This is basically an inspection level data set. So for each inspection that OSHA has conducted since at least the early 1990s, we have the date of the inspection, the reason, right, was it triggered by a complaint, an injury, or something else. OSHA also conducts these routine called program inspections, which I'll get to in a later slide. We have a lot of employer characteristics, including where they're located, their industry, the name and address, and also something that'll come up later, the union status, where the workers at that employer are covered by a union or not. Okay, second piece of data we need, workplace demographics. Now, ideally, we'd have the share of the workers that are Hispanic or some of their workplace, by establishment. That's not something we have. I think it in theory exists from the EEOC, but it wouldn't even really work for our purposes. So what our proxy measure is, we use the share of workers that are Hispanic at the county industry level. So we get this from the ACS. We use the years 2005 to 2007, which is prior to the onset of the immigration enforcement program we're going to look at. So we just use the ACS data to measure from among ACS respondents what share of respondents that work in a given county industry are Hispanic. And by industries, these are roughly 2-digit NAICS codes. For our main sample, we use agriculture, construction, and manufacturing for a couple of reasons. All of our results are pretty much similar if we use all industries as well. Now we use alternatives, right? As I said, there's reason to believe that the chilling effect of immigration enforcement could extend to broadly to Hispanic workers, but we can consider other sorts of groups that might be affected by immigration enforcement. This could be the share of workers that are non-citizen, the share that are Hispanic non-citizen, et cetera. Now, a relatively big concern here is that we are using the ACS, a 1% sample of the US, to measure what we think of as a population measure for a county industry, right? The share of ACS respondents that are Hispanic to infer the share of workers in the county industry that are Hispanic. There's going to be classical measurement error here because this is going to be a right-hand side variable. Whenever we're going to have attenuation bias. So we address this measurement error in a couple ways, all of which, as expected, increase the magnitudes of any estimates that we show later on. Okay, finally, our measure of local immigration enforcement. Again, we use the county participation in this federal immigration enforcement program called Secure Communities. This was a federal program where local law enforcement agencies automatically shared the fingerprints of arrestees with ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. Again, this was a federal program that was rolled out across US counties between 2008 and 2013. I think the first county was Harris County, where Houston is in Texas in 2008, and then it rolled out across the US from then on. There was mandatory participation by counties. So the real variation here is just when the program commenced. Now, this program, Secure Communities, really did lead to a meaningful increase in deportation risk. By many estimates, the program led to over 500,000 additional removals between 2008 and 2016. So this coincides with the real risk of the real increase in the risk of deportation. Now, one thing I'll say, this is in the paper, of course, with any sort of program like this that's rolled out over time, there's a question of, is the sort of timing of the rollout exogenous? Is it going to bias our estimates? We have a lot of things in the paper that address, the geographic variation of the rollout. The punchline is it's more or less exogenous for our purposes. We can do a whole host of things to account for the timing, and all of our results are robust. So this is going to lead us to a unit of observation of the county industry year. We're going to have a bit over 90,000 county industry years that we use over this time period, 2003 to 2016. Okay, so before I get into the causal effect of immigration enforcement, let me just show you some correlational evidence that suggests that Hispanic workers do face relatively higher barriers to complain relative to non-Hispanic counterparts. So what I'm showing you here is first just a bin scatter plot where, again, the unit of observation is the county industry year. The horizontal axis is the share of the county industry workforce that's Hispanic. On the vertical axis is the injury rate, the rate of these injury-driven inspections per worker. And this is a relationship that's residualized on a bunch of things like industry year, region year, county characteristics, in the demographics, et cetera. Right. So residuals and all that stuff. In these workplaces that have more Hispanic workers face higher injury rates, suggesting that these hazards increase with the share of the workers that are Hispanic. But despite these elevated injury risks, these workplaces with more Hispanic workers are less likely to complain to OSHA. So this bin scatter plot on the right is identical, except now the vertical axis shows the rates of complaints to OSHA per worker. So despite the fact that workplaces with Hispanic workers face more workplace injuries, they're less likely to complain. Now this could be due to a whole host of things. It could be preferences, it could be sorting, but it's at least some kind of motivational evidence that there might be relatively higher barriers to complain among Hispanic workers. Okay, so with that motivation in mind, let me show you how we try to estimate the causal effect of immigration enforcement on worker complaints and worker injuries. So we're going to do kind of a standard difference design here. I'll show you the regression specification we do for an event study. We also use kind of a standard fixed effects one. So the dependent variable here, right, is the inverse hyperbolic sine of certain types of the number of certain types of inspections for a county industry year. The types of inspections we'll use are either complaint-driven or injury-driven inspections. We use inverse hyperbolic sine just because there's a fair amount of zeros. All of our results are pretty much the same, we use logs. So the coefficients we care about are these that are highlighted in blue. These are kind of the event study coefficients, the indicators for each year relative to the year a county enters into secured communities, normalized for the T-1 year to be 0. Those indicators interacted with this exposure measure. So the exposure measure is a county industry share of workforce that are Hispanic, right? So this is going to tell us for each year relative to the onset of the immigration enforcement kicking in, how did the complaint rates or injury rates of workplaces with Hispanic workers change relative to workplaces with no Hispanic workers? All right, that's kind of a mouthful. This is controlling for a bunch of fixed effects, including county industry year, region year, exposure year, and then a few other control variables here, just to improve precision. Okay, so the first main finding that we see is that immigration enforcement leads to immediate and persistent drops in complaints in workplaces with Hispanic workers. So these are those event study coefficients interact with our exposure measure. What you see in the years prior to the onset of secure communities, there's really no distinguishable trend in complaints. If anything, there's a slight upward trend. The year that secure communities kicks in, complaints drop, and then they continue to persistently drop at even more magnitude in the following years, suggesting that immigration enforcement reduced the likelihood of complaining to OSHA among Hispanic workers. But we see the flip side, or the opposite side, and the dependent variable here is the county industry's injury rate, or excuse me, number of injury inspections. In fact, among workplaces with Hispanic workers, immigration enforcement led to more workplace injuries. We see there's a little bit more of a lag than there was with complaints, right? In the year of onset, there's really no effect. It takes a year or two to really kick in, kind of consistent with what might be lagging effects by the response of employers. So how do we interpret these magnitudes? It's a little tricky because we're using these county industry shares of demographics rather than kind of any individual level worker demographics. But if we make some kind of strong assumptions, but which at least give us a sense of the magnitude here, if we assume that immigration enforcement has zero effect on the behavior of non-Hispanic workers, and that its effect on Hispanic workers is independent of the demographics of his or her coworkers, so the effect of immigration enforcement on Hispanic workers likely to complain doesn't matter if that worker has lots of other Hispanic coworkers or not. Again, these are pretty strong assumptions, but at least just give us a sense of the ballpark here. And that would indicate that secure communities reduce complaints by Hispanic workers by at least 18% increase their risk of injury among Hispanic workers by at least 11%. Now I say at least because, as I'll allude to in a bit, when we address the measurement error in our workplace demographics, these magnitudes actually go up. Now, won't bore you with all the robustness checks we do, but these results are robust to a lot of things. If we use alternative exposure measures, such as non-citizen or Hispanic non-citizen, the results like magnitudes actually increase. If we kind of address the selection into early adoption of secure communities, nothing changes. If we control for confounders, like the potential effects of the Great Recession, yada, 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 all the results are remarkably stable. One thing we do, as I said, there's measurement error in our Hispanic workforce share. I think, let's see, do I have time? I think I can show these. So I'll just briefly show how we do this measurement error. So one thing that's kind of cool, as I said, we measure the share of the workforce that's Hispanic on the ACS. We also have a separate measure from the quarterly workforce indicators, which is a public use aggregate of the LEHD. These are actually completely independent measures. So the nice thing is we have two independent measures of the share of the workforce that's Hispanic for a county industry. Because they're independent, we can instrument one with the other to try to address the attenuation bias from the measurement error. So, don't worry too much about kind of the magnitudes here. But for example, if you compare column 1 and 2, when we instrument the QWI demographic measure with the ACS measure, compared to column 1, the magnitude of the effect increases by about almost 50%. This is sort of in line with the idea that attenuation bias is diminishing our results, but also suggests that the magnitudes of these effects are even larger than our baseline results indicate. Okay, I've got about 2 minutes here, so let me just try to wrap up here. So, we started with this tweet from David Michaels, this idea that immigration enforcement might have this chilling effect on workers' willingness to complain. Employers might internalize that and subsequently relax their investments in safety, and expose workers to more hazards. And there could be other reasons this is going on. So we provide 3 pieces of evidence to support this interpretation of the evidence that we find. So one is that we don't see any evidence that secure communities really had much of a compositional effect. We don't see any changes in the share of the workforce that's Hispanic after immigration enforcement. So it's not like there's a bunch of new workers coming in, new workers are more likely to be injured or things like that. Another thing we show is that secure communities increase violations of OSHA regulations at workplaces with more Hispanic workers. So here we use the occurrence of these inspections that I mentioned earlier that are kind of routine programs that are not themselves endogenous events. And we find that violations increase, suggesting that employers' inputs into safety actually declined following immigration enforcement. And finally, one thing that's really interesting we find is that secure communities had no effect on injuries or complaints at unionized workplaces. Again, I said, we have the union stats from the OSHA IMS data set, and a fair amount of these workplaces are unionized, and the effects we see are entirely driven by non-union workers, which is suggestive of the idea that unions can file complaints on workers' behalf, shield them from any sort of retaliation, consistent with the idea of the workers with a chilling effect we would expect them the most are the ones driving these results. So I think I'm a little bit over here. So I'll just conclude here by saying we find kind of from a regulatory point of view, local immigration enforcement makes worker complaints a less effective signal for hazardous working conditions. And on the worker-employer relationship, we see employers responded to this decrease in the likelihood of worker complaints, leading to an increase in workplace injury rates. So going forward, it'd be interesting to test other policies that affect workers' willingness to complain and see if that goes on to change workplace hazards. My email's here. If you have any other follow-up thoughts, thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks so much. Really excellent work. Right, we'll turn it over to Ioana, who's presenting work with me and UA.
All right. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk today about wage inequality and labor rights violations. And this very much fits into, it's related to every paper in this session, pretty much. So I'm really excited to be part of this session. So as we know, wage inequality in the US is considerable and has been growing since the 1980s. But the difference between, as we've learned today, there's many ways in which better and worse jobs differ besides the wage. It's not just about the wage, but it's about working conditions, we've seen about benefits, take-up, and more generally, worker power, which I think is something that we economists have underappreciated in terms of focusing a lot on wages and relatively less on these other dimensions of job quality, again, including worker conditions and workers' ability to have agency within the firm. So that's sort of the big picture question. And then we want to ask to what extent inequality in job quality deepens wage inequality. And we've seen from the first two papers in this session that it looks like, in fact, better jobs also pay more rather than the other way around. And in fact, theoretically, if we hadn't seen this evidence already, what you would think about is that wages could be negatively correlated with job quality. So in the case of compensating differentials, or it could be positively correlated, and I call that good job bundle, where good jobs tend to be better along both different amenities characteristics and the wages that they pay. So in this particular paper, we're going to focus as a measure of job quality on labor violations. So these are final complaints that were adjudicated and finished, and the firm was found, liable for that particular infraction. And so we have both the number of violations as well as the penalties. So how much the firms were fined, and we focus here on federal agencies. This data is tracked by violations trackers, and the three agencies we have consistent data for all health and safety, wage and hour divisions, and labor relations. So wage and hour divisions, just very briefly, focuses a lot on wage theft, underpaying of overtime pay, things, overtime hours, things like that. And of course, NLRB is issues around unionization and worker representation. So these are the three agencies that we're going to focus on. I really want to give a shout out to the violation tracker data, and I think more could be done with this. The reason why we focus on these three agencies is because they have consistent information about industry, which is what we're going to use to be able to convert both the number of violations and the amount of penalties into rate, right? So we want to know per worker how many violations, or per wage bill. So given how much workers are paid, how much is kind of taken away from them in the form of these violations, if we think that the penalties reflect how bad it is, which is of course not exactly true, but thinking about it this way, if the penalty reflects how bad the violation was, we can think of this as taking away wages from workers in the form of these other ways in which firms violate workers' rights. So indeed, to convert to these rates, what we do is we merge our data at the industry. So it's going to be 4-digit NAICS codes by commuting zone level. And we insert QCW data, which has data on employment and wages. And for some specifications, we also use CPS data by state, but basically we try to slice and dice the data at the finest possible cell, in order to have more observations and more power. So what do we find? Well, across industries, first of all, so this is cross-sectionally, we validate our measure by showing that labor violations per employee, as well as penalties per dollar of wage bill, are positively correlated with bad working conditions, as measured in, guess what, the survey we talked about today with David's presentation, the 2015 American Working Conditions Survey. So fantastic, this data is available, everybody should check it out and avail yourselves of this if you're working on these kinds of topics. And then our key result, after having validated our measure and showing that in fact it's correlated with working conditions, we showed that labor violations deepen wage inequality. So within local industries over time, a 10% increase in the average local industry wage is associated with a 0.5% decrease in the number of violations per employee, and also an even stronger effect, a 4% decrease in fines per dollar of pay. So in other terms, our pattern is consistent with higher paying jobs, also having fewer violations and a smaller incidence in terms of the gravity of the violations. And therefore, if you incorporate this violation dimension, so workers' rights, there's even more inequality across the distribution than if you weren't incorporating this. And we also find, we look at other aspects. So, our main result is about pay, but we also look at other measures of worker power, which one is labor market concentration. So how much competition we have in these local labor markets, as well as unionization. So we showed that decreases in labor market concentration and increases in unionization, both of those reflecting a better position for workers to bargain for themselves, are associated with lower labor violations. All right, now jumping into a little bit of the data and the results. So this is just descriptive data. I invite you to look at the lower right panel for all violations together for our 3 federal agencies. Remember, it's OSHA, so Health and Safety, Wage and Hour Division, as well as NLRB, so issues about unionization and work organization. By the way, the NLRB is a very small share of complaints. Most of it is OSHA and Wage and Hour Division, so mostly health and safety and wage issues. So if you look at all, so lower right panel, you can see which industries have the highest prevalence of these violations in terms of violations per employee. And the winner by far is construction, that's like the #1. And then it's followed by agriculture, manufacturing, and mining. And then you can see that this, order of industries is not that different across agencies, but we see in terms of wage and hours divisions that, for example, in particular, leisure and hospitality, while it's not among the top 5 in the other agencies, leisure and hospitality is number 3 offender in terms of the number of violations per employee as far as underpaying workers, wage theft, and issues like that. All right, so this is just to give you an idea of what's happening by industries. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the data. So why did we choose, or what's the advantage of this data compared to surveys on working conditions, which we have seen a very nice one today, and we've used that for validation. So our data is more exhaustive in the sense that it covers multiple years across all employers, and we can see both national and local trends. However, it does come with some difficulty of interpretation that I want to point out here, which is, remember, this data we have is on completed investigation where employers were found guilty or liable for these infractions. And, when you think about the number of violations as well as the penalties, they are the result of a selection process, which is that first employers must be committing some violation. Then the workers must be reporting these violations. We've just seen, in the prior paper that there could be issues around reporting. And then the agencies who are enforcing, have their own, skin in the game here, and the particular way in which they choose to prosecute or enforce or investigate different employers. So, I want to be transparent that therefore our data is kind of an amalgamation of all those behaviors, and therefore makes it a little bit more complicated to interpret. So because of that, we do think of ways of validating this. As I already mentioned, we validate our violation prevalence by showing that bad working conditions in the cross-section are correlated with more violations in our data across industries. And also, there are changes in enforcement across different regimes. In particular, each president tends to bring their own team of enforcers, and that can change the nature of enforcement. But we showed that the relationship between violations and wages is quite similar around, within each presidential term. So, that the changes in enforcement don't seem to have any, substantive effect on our main result, which is that higher wages are associated with lower violations within an industry and commuting zone. All right, so now let me move into the results. So this first table, what we see here is that it's a cross-sectional regression using the data on working conditions. And what it shows is that industries with worse reported working conditions, so this is self-reported by workers, have higher violation rates in terms of the counts per employee. So here we use a number of measures of self-reported working conditions. The first one is employer abuse. Last minute schedule change is the second column. Physical exposure, number 3 is things like being close to, dangerous chemicals, has to work in cold, difficult weather conditions, etc. Stress, whether you have a good boss and whether generally you're happy, the good workplace. You might want to think about those workplaces with a high wage fixed effect where, you also see people taking up benefits. So what we see here is that the bad things like abuse, last minute change, and physical exposure are also correlated with more violations per employee. The other things in this measure are not significant, but directional in terms of the sign. The good things like good boss and good workplace have a negative sign, right? So there's fewer violations there. Then we can do the same exercise, but this time we're going to regress this measure of self-reported working conditions on the intensity of violation. So how much of fines these industries paid relative to their wage bill, right? So here the results are much more significant, and you can see that workers who experience abuse, last minute change, and physical exposure are more likely to also be in workplaces that have a lot of violations per capita. And conversely, now it's significant if workers report good bosses, good workplaces. It also is the case that on average there's fewer violations in those industries. So this is what we find here. Now, moving on to our main, so this validates, essentially the purpose of this is to validate our measure, saying that despite the fact that there's a lot of selection going on here, right? So like there's all this process by which these violations then become fines, we do see the pattern that they are related to what workers report on the ground in terms of bad working conditions on average. Now, moving on to our key question of interest, which is the relationship between labor violations and pay, average pay in that industry. So what this table shows is that as pay rises within a labor market, which is defined here by a 4-digit NAICS industry by commuting zone, labor violations fall. So in column 1, we do it cross-sectionally. And there you find the opposite relationship. And that's mostly because some of the high-paying industries like manufacturing tend to have a lot of violations. But then once you do add a local industry fixed effect in column 2, you do see the negative relationship. So as wages go up in that cell, the number of violations per 1,000 employees goes down. And then in the third column, we focus only on cells with positive violations. So, these are the places that are prone to actually have some violations. And then the relationship within those is even stronger in terms of higher level of pay, reducing the prevalence of violations within that industry commuting zone cell. Then next up, we do the same thing where the outcome, instead of being the number of violations per employee, now it's about the intensity of violations. So the total penalties paid by the industries relative to the wage bills. So per million pay. So again, one way to think about this intuitively is some sort of labor rights violation tax. If we think that these penalties are related to how bad this is what employers are doing to their workers in terms of violating rights. And so here we have, even in the cross section, we see that higher pay, so column 1, is associated with lower violation intensity. And then in column 2, we do the within regression, showing that an increase in the average industry wages at the local level is associated with lower intensity of violations. And then in column 3, again, we focus on the cells that actually have some violations, and there the result, the magnitude is even larger in terms of higher pay being associated with lower intensity of rights violation in that industry and commuting zone. Now, so that's those are our main results. Now I want to show you a little bit some heterogeneity and additional results. So here we are breaking down, we're looking at our regression that's, with industry fixed effects and time fixed effects. So it's all a panel regression. And so we look separately at OSHA. So these are, again, OSHA column 1 is health and safety violation, column 2 wage and hour division. So this is going to be wage theft, not paying overtime and so on. And column 3 is NLRB, which is issues around worker organization and unionization. So remember, in the data, most observations are from column 1 and 2. These are the main agencies. And here, of course, not surprisingly, we find that within each of those, and the magnitudes are quite similar, an increase in the industry average pay is associated with lower violations of health and safety, column 1, and in terms of wage and hour division kinds of violations, column 2. In column 3, we find that that breaks the pattern, that in terms of union rights and organization, in fact, an increase in worker pay is associated with more NLRB violations. And this is the measure we use here just for simplicity. I'm just showing you the penalty per million pay because that measure tends to produce stronger effects. So that's by agency, just breaking it down by agency. And then last thing I want to show you is the effect of labor market concentration. So the big picture thought here is that if you have less competition in the labor market, you're going to have additional power of employers to violate workers' rights, because workers have fewer outside option where they can go if in fact their rights are violated. And labor market concentration is one way to measure the prevalence of workers' outside options. So therefore, if that's the case, we'd expect higher labor market concentration to be associated with more labor rights violations. However, if you do this regression in OLS, you find the opposite, that higher labor market concentration has fewer violations. But once you use an instrument for concentration, which is essentially, I'm not going to go into detail here, but concentration in other markets, not the current market, you do find a positive relationship, that an increase in labor market concentration, which remember means fewer outside options for workers, less competition for workers, is associated with an increase in violations as measured by the penalties per million pay. So let me now conclude. So we've seen that labor rights violations predict worse self-reported job quality across industries, so that validates our measures. Then we see quantitatively that a 10% increase in average wages in an industry and commuting zone is associated with a 0.15% decline in violations per employee and a 4% decline in fines per dollar of worker pay. So big picture message is that job quality is positively correlated with the wage, in contrast, right, to the prediction of a simple compensating differential model. So it seemed to be more around the issue of job bundles. There's the good jobs out there, they pay high wages, they have low violations, and then there's the bad jobs out there that pay low wages and have a lot of violations. And therefore, inequality in job quality as measured by these labor rights violations exacerbates wage inequality in the US. All right, this is what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ioana. Excellent. Suresh, are you good to go for discussing the last two papers?
Yep.
Take like 10 or 15 minutes.
Let's do it. All right. Thanks so much for the opportunity to discuss this. I was sort of typing furiously while everyone was speaking because I had lots of thoughts along the way as well. A very stimulating panel. Thanks. Okay. Discussion. Okay. So the two papers, you just saw them, so I won't say too much about what they do. So the Marinescu et al. Paper is, 4-digit industry cross commuting zone variation in OSHA wage and hours divisions and LRB violations correlated with wages. They didn't mention this. It seems like it's driven by the Bush administration period more so. Switches sign with the NLRB, increases with concentration, decreases with union. Then there's the Grittner and Johnson paper, which is using 2-digit industry cross CZ variation in OSHA, and they find that complaint-driven versus injury-driven inspections decrease and increase differentially in high Hispanic share counties following adoption of secure communities. And so broadly, there's a point about wage inequality, but it's also that, just how good is this complaints-based enforcement system working anyway? And it's probably, I don't know how many people are familiar with this idea of like forbearance and as redistribution. It's just like, this is a way to redistribute to employers, is to basically have weak enforcement. And it's like, you know, people talk about it in Latin America all the time. It's like a way you redistribute to poor people is you don't enforce laws against formality. Well, this is like a way in which we don't we redistribute to employers by sort of like having weak enforcement of existing law. So just, I mean, both of you talked about this, but I needed to sort of write it down for myself to understand how we should think about like the equilibrium level of violations that we get. And so, you know, the way I just sort of think about it was like, okay, an employer commits to like a combination of violations or working conditions and wages. Then a worker can either quit if they don't like it or choose to report. But if they report, then the employer can comply and fix the violation, and then separately either retaliate or, and I think something neither of the paper talks about, could just shut down. And that's not retaliation. That's just like, I can't operate and be in compliance. And that would have very similar, like if a worker is thinking about, you know, do I report you know, a low margin employer, they're like, I don't want to report because I know my hairdresser employer is going to go out of business if I so that's not retaliation, but it's a reason why workers might not want to report. And so, you know, in conditions of a monopsony, quitting is costlier, but retaliation is costlier. So you can get potentially like ambiguous effects on reports. You will get like both a lower wage and a higher level of violations, but I think the effects on reporting is actually kind of ambiguous. It's also the case that with monopsony, retaliation is less credible for the employer, because remember, you're making profits off every worker, so firing them is like costly. And so relative to so it's less of a credible threat when you're making profits, when you're making monopsony profits off every worker, the threat to fire. You can think of secure communities as making retaliation costlier. So what I was curious about, okay, so employers will choose a higher level of violations and workers won't report, and that's sort of consistent with what they document. But I wonder if we also sort of get that when you don't report on this thing, you just like quit in response to this higher level of violations. And so, you know, should we in fact see this employment fall differential? And so I'm going to have a suggestion to look at the other QWI variables to everybody should be looking more at the QWI. It's just kind of a good rule. And of course, like unions just kind of take wages and the violation level out of the control of the employer with the collective bargaining agreement, and they make retaliation costlier, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of ways in which unions like turn off all the mechanisms in this setup. So the other thing this setup sort of I think matters is that the costs and benefits of violations versus compliance to employers and workers then matter. It's like, it matters how much the employer costs to be in compliance, and it matters how much the employer values the compliance also, is the valuation of reporting. And so both papers assume that workers all value the legal protections, and it's a reasonable assumption, but it's worth discussing and backing up, like, because you can imagine that there's some workers that are like, I think about all the workers that are like, I don't want to wear a mask. And so that I think we might want to account for the heterogeneity of valuations of workers for these legal protections, and that some workers might actually not want them and be willing to take like, you know, a slightly higher wage in exchange for like less protection. And so I think for like the Grittner and Johnson paper, I think one good thing to do would just put wages on the left-hand side. And actually, both papers could, and then sort of the Marinescu et al. Paper, also putting wages on the left-hand side in the HHI regression, because then that lets you, both of those effects would let you then rescale the labor violations by a wage effect. So you can then convert them into like money metrics, at least with that kind of variation. Yeah. So but employers might actually, I thought this was sort of interesting. Imagine that you're like that you actually want to credibly deter employees from reporting. You might just be like, sorry guys, I got no margin here. I'm going to stay small. I'm going to stay high turnover. I'm going to stay like a low rent firm just so that I can credibly exit if anyone reports me. And so the no effect on the small employers, and both, you know, I think you got Matt's presentation was focusing on the larger employers, like the no effect on small employers might be exactly because the smaller employers are the equilibrium outcome of the enforcement regime. And so the thing I wanted both papers to look at was like the QWI has these great measures of quits and flows, and that those are like interesting to look at because they give you kind of like proxies for voluntary separations. And so then seeing, like, rather than looking at the employment level, which is kind of a combination of a bunch of stuff, the quits in the QWI are like a good measure of like the revealed preference of workers' response to the violation. So I think like thinking about how quits should respond to the shifters you guys have is interesting. Okay, here's how much time. Okay, so yeah, I've got time. So here's my other question, which is like, where are the lawyers? So what's supposed to work here is the tort lawyers. And so OSHA doesn't give you a private right to sue, but the OSHA is someone, about 10 minutes left. But OSHA is an input into workers' comp claims, and that's where you can kind of file a workers' comp claim and get and make some legal fees off of that. And wage and hour division violations do create the legal right to sue. And so tort lawyers should be lining up to file class action lawsuits. So I don't expect these papers to have to answer this, but it's a question that it's an old idea that in the US, in the states that don't have unions, the tort lawyers kind of fill in the void of going after violations. And so what's not working about that? And so one idea is just like when you have low wages, and the low wages are correlated with the bad working conditions, there's low tort damages, and so you get low legal interest in doing that. And so again, like the system that's supposed to kick in to protect to sort of enforce this, it just doesn't work because of the incentives. I have a few data points. So both papers are kind of like are doing these ecological regressions, and it's going to come up that you're not actually seeing the actual establishment is experiencing the violation is not the one that's experiencing the treatment. It's you don't see Hispanic share of the workforce. I mean, getting the EEOC data, I don't know why that's so impossible for, like Conrad Miller's used it. I wonder if there's a way to get the EEOC data so you could actually get the linking the EEOC data to the OSHA data seems like a valuable thing to do. And so that's just going to come up, and I think figuring out like ways to defend yourself against this ecological bias thing is interesting, would be helpful. The other thing is that the violations in both are like rare events, and so you can see from the summary stats, for example, in Ioana's presentation, that it's 0 until you get to the 90th percentile of the sample, and so you just start wondering, okay, well, if so much of the sample is just zeros, what's really driving the variation between any and none? And so I think like thinking about that and being transparent about what's going on there would be helpful. Question for Matt. I was like, why are you IVing? Like, you could just use the QWI measure, because you just need a proxy for like exposure to secure communities, and you could just use the QWI measure. The reduced form might be good enough, or unless you're also worried about the same sampling things coming up in the QWI. But the other thing you could do is just do the split sample with the ACS, which is just take the ACS microdata, split it in half, and use one as a sample. And I think that'll get you pretty close to what the shrinkage method is doing, because the places where those samples are far apart are the places where you don't have enough data to get either of them estimated, and it'll push it towards like the mean. Or also just, why not use the census, like the average of the 2000 and 2010 census, which will have much bigger samples and won't have this problem because it's fixed over time. You don't need a time. It's like you're not using a time varying measure. Another idea here. This is just kind of something I've been sort of thinking about is that there's this chemical exposure health data that is like filed with OSHA that actually has way more detailed stuff, and it's like the detailed reports that OSHA inspectors make about the chemicals that are like workers are exposed to on a work site, and not all of them, and they're not even necessarily all used to generate complaints or used for violations. So they're actually just like a measurement tool, and so you can actually like measure these like chemical exposures. And there's actually a 2012 chemical labeling reform that actually mandates that employers have to like label chemicals. And I'm particularly wondering with the Hispanic share, it's like in the National Agricultural Workers Survey, they asked these survey questions on pesticide exposure in agriculture. And this is like a great sort of place to sort of see where like employers in in California just start using more pesticides after secure communities would be kind of like the mechanism. I was curious about what we would think of if we had in Ioana's papers, the omitted productivity shocks raising the benefits of like the question is like, are violations just pure costs, or do they interact with the production function in some way? And so if you did have like a productivity shock, would you in fact see violations go up? And so you can imagine speed up or overtime or things that come along with productivity shocks. And so I wasn't sure exactly how to get at this, but it's going to bias this correlation between the violations of wages, because it's not sure the wage variation that you're seeing is on the demand driven or supply driven wage variation. So I was like, oh, maybe we could isolate the demand variation. The other thing, I already said this, is like put wages as an outcome to get the valuation. I also think you guys should just, the NLRB violation just seemed like a different animal. I would use those as like a placebo rather than like keep treating them as part of a good job. It's like a totally different mechanism is delivering NLRB, unfair labor practices and NLRB violations. So I would keep those as a separate thing from good jobs, because you need a union to generate them. That's okay, so that's all my comments. I just have one sort of meta comment that's like relating the first talk to the first set of papers to these set of papers. So I think there's actually like a really, particularly David's paper, which is kind of like something I've been thinking about. So a project that really is inspired by what David did is that Aaron and Dubé and I and co-authors have been sort of doing this for Walmart workers, using the fact that you can use Facebook to target workers very narrowly. So you can target particular employers and like basically, and then get surveys in front of like all the workers on Facebook with that employer. And then you just kind of like randomize, you give them sort of similar like choice, would you quit your job for a job that looks like this? But the other thing you can use these kinds of surveys for is actually check for violations, because you have a direct pipeline to workers and you can just be running large scale online surveys that workers are seeing. You pay them to fill it out, whatever. So actually, you don't even need to pay them most of the time. The people just will fill them out for fun. So, and you can check for like minimum wage violations by looking for reporting above and beyond what you'd expect from like survey response error. So one thing we've sort of found is that Walmart, like no one's reporting, or very, very few people are reporting wages below Walmart's $11. So it's like when you plot the distribution of reported wages, it really looks like that $11 is like binding. So that suggests, oh wow, they actually are complying with their own internal wage standards. So I kind of like the idea that like an empowered DOL would just start running tons and tons of online surveys and just asking workers directly about conditions on their job in an anonymous way, so that you're not kind of you don't have to rely on workers like having to figure out how to file a complaint and all of this stuff. You just like put it in front of them and ask them directly. And so that would be kind of a cool way to use kind of the online, the low cost of running surveys to assist in enforcement. And I'm done.
That's great, Suresh. Thank you so much for all those thoughtful suggestions and perspectives. It's really good. And so we have about less than 10 minutes left. We have about 8 minutes left. I don't see many questions from the attendees in the Q&A, but if you have them, you know, put them in there. And why don't we give Matt and Ioana a chance to respond to if they'd like, any of the issues Suresh raised.
I'll say a couple things. Suresh, I was writing furiously, so I'll hope you can send me those slides because there are a lot of jewels in there, great ideas. I'll just say, just respond to a couple of them. I really like the idea of looking at quits. I have the data of the QWI, we should do it. And it's cool because it kind of brings up this idea of exit versus voice, the old Albert Hirschman idea, and kind of what's the worker's decision margin here when they experience a violation. So I really love that. I'd love to kind of think through more about the kind of like the predictions on that front. So I think that's a really great idea. Let's see, the differential effects by worker size, looking at wages, again, also from QWI, so we'll totally do that. I'll just say a few other things. I know with the EEOC data, I think the prior administration made it not possible for the researchers to get it anymore. It could be that changes with the new one, so that would be something for me to look towards. I hadn't even thought of using the 2010 census, so that's a great idea. There is, I think, sampling error with the QWI measure itself, from what I can tell. So I think there is the IB strategy is relevant, but I should confirm that. I'll just say one last thing. I wasn't aware of this National Agricultural Worker Survey with exposure to pesticides, so that's totally going on my list too. So anyway, thanks for a lot of really cool and productive suggestions.
Ioana or Wade, yeah.
So again, thanks so much for all the very helpful and interesting comments. I also want to say that, yeah, the quit issue is quite interesting to look at, and we'll definitely think about that. And in particular, you know, you could, of course, I'm obsessed with labor market power, and you might expect that in markets that have less labor market competition or more concentrated, for example, workers may not be able to quit, you know, in response to either lower wages or more violations. So I think that's definitely an interesting angle to think about. So, you know, we'll definitely consider that angle as well. And then regarding the NLRB, I speculatively, and you know, Aaron and you might chime in here. I think what might be going on here is that when wages go up, there's more unionization drives because we kind of know that there's selective, like who's getting picked for unionizing, and that perhaps that's partly driving violations. That, you know, if there's more drives, there's also more violations. So that might be part of the explanation of why the effect goes in the opposite direction for the NLRB. But in any case, it's a very small share of the overall violations, and perhaps we should perhaps treat it differently. But, you know, just a quick speculative answer about why the sign might be different. I don't know, Aaron or you, if you have any additional thoughts. Aaron, you're muted.
Yeah, not me. So, okay, well, I guess I see there's some chatting going on. I guess the chat's open now to everybody. So you're welcome to put things in there. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say overall, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to the presenters. I think we have so much to learn still about these issues, you know, and the enforcement of rights and the realities of jobs beyond wages. And I think, you know, an area that I'm really fascinated by is like, how much do workers know about a job before they take the job, or how do they learn about it? The experience goods sort of story that Jason brought up. I think there's just really fertile ground there that hasn't been explored deeply. And so I'm really glad to see so many people working on these issues, and I hope it'll continue. I think there's so much to learn still, and a lot of important issues are linked to these information problems. And so I don't know, anybody else? Otherwise, we'll let everybody grab a cup of coffee before the next session. So thanks, everybody. Happy New Year, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for hosting, Aaron. That was good.
Yeah. Thanks for participating.
Yeah, see y'all.